And so I asked our teacher after this whole exercise, how do you actually go about changing the world? Like tactically speaking, what are ways to embody that message? And he told me, Ben, one of the best ways to change the world is to be an entrepreneur.
Ben Casnocha, thank you so much for joining me on 20-Minute Leaders. I am so thankful to have you here. Thank you for being so generous with your time.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
It's a pleasure to have you. We have way too much to talk about. I want to just run forward and considering everything that you've done, which is incredible. I'd love to hear about Village Global. I'd love to hear about your work with Reid Hoffman and the two New York Times bestsellers that you wrote and the different insights that you've gained into helping young entrepreneurs on their journey. The majority of the audience for this show is young entrepreneurs like myself, just starting their journey. And I think that going back and reliving some of these lessons that you so thoughtfully highlight in a lot of your writing, that will just be incredible. So Ben, how about you take me down memory lane? Just walk me through some of the really cool things that you've gotten to take a part of. And we'll touch on some lessons here and there from there. And I'll, of course, interrupt when I'm especially curious.
Well, when I was 12 years old, I took a class in school that was a computer repair class. And so we learned how to fix and repair Macintosh computers as an elective course at my school. And it was designed, of course, to allow the school to use us as child labor to repair all the school computers when they broke. But I learned a lot about how to fix computers, and it was a really helpful class. And at the end of the semester, we had a final exam. But the final exam was very different than any other exam I've taken. The teacher announced that all we would have to do to get an A+ in the exam is memorize and recite a poem back to him perfectly. And if we could do that successfully, he would give us an A+ in the class. So the exam would have nothing to do with all of the material we had studied in the class. All we would have to do is recite a poem. And so 24 hours before the class, he distributes the poem. And it actually turns out not to be a literary poem, but rather the text transcription of Apple Computer's Think Different television advertisement, which ran in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So if you haven't seen the ad, you can go on YouTube and search for Apple Computer Think Different, and you can see the ad for yourself. But I was forced to memorize that ad when I was 12 years old and recite it back to him perfectly. And maybe I'll share it with you now, just for folks who don't know how it goes. It's short. The advertisement says, "Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. But about the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things and they push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." And so at a really young age, I was reciting this message back to him.
12 years old.
Yeah, it was like life-changing. And so I asked our teacher after this whole exercise, how do you actually go about changing the world? Like tactically speaking, what are ways to embody that message? And he told me, Ben, one of the best ways to change the world is to be an entrepreneur, is to see opportunity where other people see challenge, to not just complain about problems in the world, but try to solve those problems. And he said, the next time you experience frustration in your life, ask yourself whether you could solve that frustration for you and everyone else who has that frustration, and maybe make some money while doing it. And, up until that point in my life, I had really not thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I didn't know much about entrepreneurship, but he really inspired me to apply that lens to the world, to see problem as opportunity. And so I started my first company when I was 14 years old, and I've never looked back.
Seeing every problem as an opportunity. I love that. I've been thinking that I recall when I was in the IDF and I was leading a team there, and we're constantly faced with problems, and especially in a very bureaucratic area, a lot of the times these problems surrounded the lack of funding and the lack of our ability to get new talent coming in. We had what we had, and a lot of times people kept saying, Michael, we have a problem, and I kept thinking, no, we have an opportunity for a solution, and I just love that embodiment and mindset. So walk me through some of the other experiences that you've had, and how have you used that mindset to get excited about these problems that you're facing?
Well, the first bias that I had about the mindset was that it was a Silicon Valley only idea. I was living and growing up in San Francisco actually at the time. And so as I learned more about entrepreneurship, I assumed that what entrepreneurship meant was starting a technology business in Silicon Valley because that's what everyone else was doing around me. And it wasn't until I really started traveling and I left the US for the first time and traveled around meeting with different people who I'd met online, who had been following some of my writing, that I realized that entrepreneurship was actually global, that there were people all around the world with that mindset. And there are people creating all different types of businesses all around the world. You didn't need to be in San Francisco. You actually also didn't need to be starting a tech business. There are lots of different types of businesses to start. There are a lot of problems to solve in the world. And so a really formative experience for me after after my teacher forced me to memorize the Apple advertisement was leaving America for the first time when I was maybe 18 years old and spending 4 or 5 months in Asia and Europe and Latin America and some in the Middle East, and just meeting all these different people who were inspiring me with their own entrepreneurial energy. And that really taught me that entrepreneurship is a global idea and that it's a life idea more than a business one. It's a mindset that you apply to your life and to any industry. You don't just have to be starting an internet company.
I just love that. Obviously, coming from Israel, my grandparents came on the boats into a kibbutz, and that whole entrepreneurial journey. They're telling me, like, Michael, you think you're an entrepreneur, you go to Silicon Valley with all your VC friends, and you come startups. No, the real entrepreneurship story is of how this world is formed and how we built railroads and how we invented, agriculture in the middle of the desert. I mean, these are the real, and so I couldn't agree more. And talk to me a little bit about Village Global, because it's a phenomenal idea. It's not just another venture capital fund. You're building this incredible community of global thinkers and global leaders. Probably if I just start reciting the names, the jaws are going to drop of people that are involved. And I have some great friends that are a part of this network. Tell me a little bit about what you've built and what was the motivation behind building this $100 million venture capital fund?
Yeah, a few years ago, my partners and I founded Village Global to be an entirely new sort of venture capital firm. And we believed that the nature of entrepreneurship was changing. And so we needed to build a venture platform that would change with it, that would adapt to this new world of entrepreneurship and the new world of work. Some of the ways that entrepreneurship have changed include this global point that we've been talking about, which is there are great talent all around the world. It's cheaper and easier to start a company than ever before. And increasingly, software is transforming all different types of industries. And so it's a much more diverse set of businesses today that VCs ought to invest in rather than just traditional software companies. And so we built Village with the idea of being a network-driven venture firm that could invest around the world in all different types of IT-enabled businesses. One of the things that makes Village unique is we believe that today's young entrepreneurs derive a great deal of inspiration from their iconic heroes in the industry. People like Mark Zuckerberg, people like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and other folks like that. And so we spent a long time raising our fund from those people. So those people are the investors in Village. And then we take their personal capital and we in turn invested in the smartest entrepreneurs that we can find so as to sort of bridge the generations between today's young entrepreneurs and the luminaries who back Village.
So just to iterate, this notion that you're taking people like Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and the likes, literally investing their personal funds into a venture capital fund whose mission it is to invest globally in IT solutions that are really breakthrough and in the smartest people. How do you go about fulfilling that mission? First of all, it sounds like it's a lot of responsibility. It sounds like a very scary responsibility to take. But I'm sure that it's incredibly exciting. But how do you actually go ahead and deploy that strategy and find those best people around the world?
We have a unique network model for discovering the best talent around the world. So, most venture capital firms historically have operated where there's a handful of general partners who sit in an office, usually in Menlo Park, California, or some other ecosystems, Tel Aviv, different places around the world where there are a lot of VCs. But the partners really act as if they are masters of the universe, as if they know all of the people who matter, and they expect founders to parade into their office and pitch their business. But we have a different approach. We leverage a network of founders themselves, angel investors, professors, ecosystem leaders, and we empower those people with our capital to go back their smartest friends. And so it's a bit more of a decentralized effort to source and select the smartest founders we can. And by using a network, we're able to find really amazing entrepreneurs in hidden and undiscovered places.
Wow. What do you get most excited about? Because you're coming from a very entrepreneurial background. You've built several companies. Your companies have made a huge impact back then. And I believe that some of the companies that you've built, their technology is still being deployed today, one of which is used by hundreds of local governments. So you've made a huge impact as an entrepreneur yourself, and now you're making a huge impact as a venture capital investor. What really makes you excited about what you're doing?
I think the thing that's really exciting about our work is being the first to believe in a founder. So we are often at Village, we're often investing in pre-seed and seed stage rounds or formation stage rounds where we're the first person to commit to the first firm to commit to a founder. And so we really feel like we are increasing the total entrepreneurship in the world. There's a lot of capital that will pile into late stage venture rounds where they're already, Stripe, for example, apparently is raising a new round of financing at $100 billion valuation. That's awesome. And Stripe's had a huge impact, but it's more fulfilling for me to think that we could be the first to invest in Stripe rather than at the $2 million valuation rather than the $100 billion valuation. Because that's what it means to bet on underdogs. That's what it means to take a risk. That's what it means to believe when others do not. And I think there's something very satisfying about having that sort of contrarian view and then seeing all these other investors follow us at later stages.
100%. I took a fascinating class with Anne from Floodgate at Stanford, the venture capital class. And one of the things that we talked about was the different investment stages. I have the privilege of doing due diligence in a fund called J Ventures, very early stage. And one of the key differences that I was always taught was that if you're investing early stage, your due diligence is mainly about the people. It's about their backgrounds, about their personality and their perseverance. Their due diligence on later stages is a lot also about the spreadsheets, about the finances, about you believing in the business model moving forward. So I can definitely see the excitement that you bring towards this. Ben, take me back a little bit to your entrepreneurial journey. Obviously, you're doing incredible stuff now with Village Global, but that's just the sliver of your humongous experience. Talk to me about the different ventures that you've formed and the 2 books that you've written with Reid Hoffman.
Sure. Well, I rolling back the clock to that class that I took where I memorized the Apple advertisement, and then the global trip I took that opened my eyes to global entrepreneurship. I spent several years founding and running an enterprise software company that sold CRM software to local governments. And I really enjoyed that experience, and that business continues today to serve a whole bunch of customers in the US. I took a few years break from entrepreneurship and focused on writing. And those are the books you mentioned. So I co-authored a book called The Startup of You, which is a career strategy guide on how to apply entrepreneurial insights to your own life. And then I co-authored a book called The Alliance, which is about how companies can attract entrepreneurial talent into their organizations. And
New York Times bestsellers, but that's irrelevant, of course.
Well, we were really lucky that both books found an engaged audience, and both topics are really interesting, I think. And I learned a lot. Writing forces you to clarify your thinking, and so to really flesh out my views and to get to know my co-author Reid Hoffman, who started LinkedIn, in both of those books, was a really tremendous privilege. And so I've been going back and forth in my life between writing and entrepreneurship. These days, I'm 100% focused on Village Global and entrepreneurship and venture capital. But I suspect in the future, I'll go back to writing books at some point and hopefully go back and forth, because you can have a different sort of impact writing books. For me, my drug of choice is impact. So entrepreneurship certainly one way, but you can also influence the way people think. And books and articles are a way of doing that for me.
Right. All this back and forth, going from being an entrepreneur to being a writer, spending time at the LinkedIn and Greylock offices, venture capital, suspecting going back. Talk to me about this whole mindset of moving around and experiencing and really mastering and harnessing these different skill sets as a lifelong entrepreneur.
Well, I think some of us live lives that are unplanned and serendipitous and involve lots of zigging and zagging. And that's certainly been my life. I've never had a grand master plan. Every year brings its own share of surprises and opportunities. Of course, the year 2020 is a great example of this. Whatever plan people may have laid in January has almost certainly been disrupted by the pandemic. And so I'm a huge believer in staying adaptive, staying flexible, and being opportunistic as things arise. And for me, sort of my blessing and my curse is that I have a lot of different interests. And so there are a lot of things I want to do in this world that are somewhat unrelated to each other. And so for me, venture capital is an interesting path because it does actually involve a lot of diversity. There are a lot of different types of businesses we invest in, a lot of different sorts of challenges. And that's satisfying. By contrast, when you start a company, it requires a lot of focus on just that company for a very long period of time. And there are advantages to that. I actually think you can have the most impact in the world by starting a business, much more than a VC can. But the trade-off is you're really thinking about that one industry, that one product area for potentially 10 to 12, 15, 20 years of your life. And so for me, my own zigging and zagging in life has been an attempt to satisfy a diverse set of interests.
Going back all the way to being 12 years old and reciting that great poem. But then, a lot of the people that are hopefully watching this are young entrepreneurs, either they're from Stanford, any other college in the US, from Tel Aviv, and it's scary. It feels like a constant race. There's a lot of pressure going on that you have to raise the most amount of money, and you have to hire quickly, and you have to scale really quickly. And what I'd love to spend the last few minutes is talking a little bit about your perspective on this fresh young entrepreneurial experience and what myself and my friends can take away moving forward as we begin our entrepreneurial journey at the end to make an impact. What are some key things that we should be keeping in mind and some key pieces of advice that you've accumulated over the years?
Well, I think the sense of pressure on oneself has pros and cons. I mean, the truth is, it is a very competitive world. If you want to be successful in anything that you do, it would seem to be obvious when you look at other successful people that hard work's required and that a lot of people try to be successful but can't. And especially in fields like entrepreneurship and venture capital, it requires a ton of work and a lot of luck, I think, to achieve any modicum of success. So it's rational to feel some stress about that. At the same time, of course, you don't want to let the stress and anxiety and the fear be debilitating. And it's useful, I think, to cultivate a spiritual practice or to codify a set of personal values or to remember the bigger picture about what matters in life with regards to relationships and family and things like that, so as to not be totally overtaken by the stress involved with one's career ambitions.
100%.
I'd say with respect to sort of things to keep in mind, I think if the best decisions that I've ever made and the worst decisions I've ever made have had to do with people and judgment of people. And so probably the single best meta skill to develop, or one of the best meta skills, because I could think of some others as I say this, such as how to learn. But the meta skill for this conversation that comes to mind, Michael, is being really good at evaluating people and understanding whether you want someone in your tribe, whether you want someone working at your company, whether it's somebody you want to work for, and just calibrating your sense of how do people present themselves? What are the sorts of things I'm looking for? When is someone trying to deceive me? When is someone deceiving themselves and they lack self-awareness about their strengths and weaknesses, et cetera? People are enormously complicated. They're also fascinating. To get really good at understanding the psychology of people is a generalizable skill that I think will be helpful in any number of career paths.
Right, 100%. One of the things that I've gotten exposed myself over the past year and a half or so in Palo Alto has been how many opportunities there are, and people that are curious about, especially engineering, and you're investing primarily in software and in IT solutions. I mean, the number of opportunities are just endless, and the ways in which we can really improve the world is just phenomenal. And for me as a young entrepreneur, what I get most excited about is just thinking of all the different things we can do that can make a huge impact. Which is why I just love the way that you're talking about the zigzagging, this lifelong entrepreneurial journey. It's not just about what you're working on now. It's about how you're approaching every problem with a potential solution and motivating others along the way. Because I'm sure that just by having that mindset yourself, every person that interacts with Ben gets that motivation as well. So thank you for being inspiration for me and for whoever else is watching this. Before we go, I really want to thank you for being generous with your time. And the hardest question: 3 words that you would use to describe yourself.
3 words that come to mind. The first, obvious, entrepreneurial. The second, curious. I have a lot of different interests. I'm curious about things. And the third would be reflective. I tend to reflect a lot on my life and the world around me, and for better or for worse, reflective would be my third choice.
It's very counterintuitive to see someone who's so driven, who's done so much, and then say that they're one of the words that best describes them is reflective, which often has a connotation of sitting back, taking a moment, breathing, and thinking through what they're feeling. So I highly appreciate that. Ben, thank you very much. Stay safe and stay healthy during these crazy times, and I hope to meet in person back in Silicon Valley.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me.